Vendor management is a key area that Chief Information Security Officers, Chief Information Officers have to deal with as it's intended to address risk to organizations from third parties, people you're buying stuff from. Vendor management, again, it's about how do I control risk to my organization from all of these entities, all of these organizations that I have relationships with. Purchasing relationships, vending relationships, and even interconnection relationships with to a certain degree. How do I manage the risk to my organization from all of those connections? Some vendors are probably more risky than others from the standpoint of information security. Look at cloud service providers, HR, payment card, or point of sale systems, and anybody with access to my network as an organization. Those types of vendors are going to be more risky to me as an organization because I have to transmit information to them. They have to send information to me. And part of that might include they have direct access to my network or they have partial access to my network. Unfortunately, there's no universally accepted framework for vendor management, and what you find is that everybody is doing things a little bit differently. To kind of accentuate this point, let's consider a example here of a printing vendor. And so you've got this vendor over here who does printing. Let's say they just take documents, Word documents, presentations, posters, whatever the case may be, but they're a print shop. Here I am as an organization. One model of vendor management might be that, okay, we have a Dropbox or an FTP site or something on within our organization that we say, okay, printing vendor, you're going to come to us, log into our site, and download all of the information that you need, print it out, and then ship us the printed products. You might say, okay, well that's one possible option here. What are the risks associated with this? Well, if I have a printing vendor and I've given them direct access to my network or partial access to my network, I now have an external entity accessing resources on my network. That might be a little risky. Another option, or another model, might say, okay, vendor, this is option 2. All right, vendor, instead of me hosting the information here, I want you to create the Dropbox over here, and I'm going to send the information to you. From a vendor management standpoint, which do you think is better? There's a big hint. Probably number 2. Why? Because now I don't have an organization, or I don't have an opening on my network that a vendor has access to. I've put the risk, as it were, on them to provide that service. So I send them my information rather than giving them access to my network. If you look for a moment at vendor selection, there's probably, in any given large organization, tens, hundreds. I've seen an organization with 1,000 or so particular vendors. And it all gets very complicated very fast. Because here, as an organization, you're relying on all of these third parties to provide stuff to your organization. Again, generic stuff, whatever that might be. You might be dealing with integrators, you might be dealing with service providers, you might be dealing with, in the example, print shops, whatever the case may be. But as you're dealing with all of these folks, recognize that these vendors also have vendors. And those vendors also have vendors. And so what we see is the category of risk that people are, that organizations are starting to get their hands wrapped around right now is this kind of middle tier right here where I've got one vendor relationship. So I'm looking at vendor Jane as a supplier. What are my risks stemming from that? What isn't really being talked about is, okay, the secondary vendors out here. So a supplier's supplier. What are the risks from that? And so you've seen with many examples recently, Target being the most visible of those, that companies are starting to look at vendor management and go, wow, there's something to this. We have risks associated with our vendors that we probably should be managing. And so we ought to look at things like, what is the vendor's background? What do they do? What's their reputation? Are they a financially sound company? Do they have information security controls? Are they going to protect my information as an organization as I do business with them? And so you go through this vendor selection process to look at your vendors and determine where is my risk coming from. So as you integrate with third parties, just recognize that this introduces a level of risk to you, especially in the previous example of the print shop operator. If I'm giving them direct access to my network, there's a risk of data compromise there. Because of that protected path, one that I would assume to be trusted, right? I expect my print shop vendor to be accessing my network. The risk from that is an adversary hops on the print shop, the network of the print shop, and uses that trusted path to get into my network. Am I really looking at it from a security monitoring perspective? Well, that's really what the vendor selection process and vendor management is all about. It's understanding those trusted paths that we have to have in place to do business and mitigating the risk from that. There's a saying that you're only as strong as your weakest link, and that is appropriately true for vendor management. Again, if you're putting in all of these connections from your different vendors, as an adversary, I'm not going to come after you. I'm going to go find one of your vendors that has the weakest information security, is very susceptible to phishing emails, and I'm going to attack them and then use that trusted path between the vendor and your organization to attack you. And so again, you're only as strong as your weakest link there. And so that's why vendor management is one of the key areas that CISOs and security personnel should be looking for. And you need to have processes in place to manage this risk. So that's understanding what the risk is, assessing the level of impact from it, and actually doing something about it. As part of the selection process, you'll find that a lot of organizations have onboarding and offboarding requirements. So how do you bring on a vendor or a new third party? How do you put in that relationship? And then when you're done working with them, how do you close that relationship to make sure that any risks that are out there are also addressed? So as part of the onboarding process, if I'm going to give you access to my network, what do I need to do? So just from a sheer tactical perspective, yeah, I've got to give you access to my network, but from an operational perspective, I'm going to look at the security of that. All right, how do I make sure that you're accessing my network in some secure manner? What data is it that you're accessing? Why do you need that data? Are there any regulations out there that we're going to run afoul of because I'm now giving you access to this data? All of these things should be thought of during the onboarding process before you actually put that relationship into place. And then also consider social media and various other applications. Who has access to these accounts? If it's your vendor, are you really sure you want to do that? What material can they post to your website? What kind of public statements can they make about you as an organization? Where can they make those statements? And then the last here, and I think is probably the most important, the impact of a compromise. All right, who has control of the data, and therefore who has control or who should have control of the response process? So if there's a compromise, who's in charge? We did a tabletop exercise a few months ago with an energy organization, and there was a concern during the tabletop exercise about a particular vendor that they had hosting their data. So this energy company had their data stored on a third-party site. It was a data hosting site, cloud provider. And so we ran the scenario during the exercise that said, okay, what happens if there's a compromise with this data? Well, the organization, the first question the energy company asked was, okay, well, was it our systems or their systems that were compromised? Well, that's a good question, Okay, so let's say that the third party was compromised. It's your information, but it's on their system. So whose fault is that? Well, fault is irrelevant at that point. It's, all right, I've had a data breach. Now who's responsible for it? Who's in charge of running the response? And what kind of statement do I need to make as a company, as an energy company? My customer information has been compromised. What do I do about it? Well, after 5 or 10 minutes of discussions, the CEO says, okay, great, I got it that they're the ones that are at fault. They're the ones who had the system breach. That's all fine and good, but it's our customers, and we need to take care of our customers. So they decided to make a statement about, we've had this breach, and information may be compromised, but, we're working on it. And they avoided the blame game. But as they started digging into, the contractual requirements they had, they realized that there's nothing in place to describe that particular scenario. And so what they found was a big gap in, their vendor management process where they hadn't considered a key area of, what happens when there's this shared responsibility. All of those things should be thought of, again, before you do this onboarding process. Interoperability agreements. So this is the notion that as a vendor, they're going to be compatible with our systems. They're going to be able to work with us. We share data, we share systems. All of that is just going to work. And all of those are usually defined in some type of contractual agreement that outlines how we're going to share data, how we're going to share services, how we're going to share systems. And there's a wide range and variety of contracts and agreements that you can use as part of that. There are service level agreements. You usually see service level agreements from a service provider standpoint. Internet service provider, communications, data availability, data storage providers. That's where you typically see a service level agreement. Then there are business partner agreements. This is usually like a strategy document that says how my business is going to work with your business. Memorandum of understanding. These are documents that define how we as organizations are going to work together without legally binding the organizations together. You usually see memorandums of understanding between organizations of similar nature. So say between service providers or between two print shop providers, to use an example. So the memorandum of understanding would dictate, we're going to share resources in event of an incident. If there's a power outage, and you get hit by a power outage, you can borrow my power generator. That sort of stuff would get covered in something like a memorandum of understanding. And then there are interconnection security agreements. And these are formal documents which describe how these companies, how a vendor is going to connect to my company, across some type of communication links. What are the risks associated with that? What are the technical requirements of that? What do I need to have in place to make sure that this interconnection between us as the organization and the vendor will work, all works together. As you start working with a vendor, consider the privacy considerations here, the risks associated with it, data sharing, and data ownership. All of these considerations are things you need to think of before you put a relationship in with a vendor. From a privacy perspective, who's controlling access to PII, or personally identifiable information? How does the vendor protect that? Risk awareness. Does the vendor do risk management? Do they know what type of information security risks they face? They've got my information. Are they protecting it accordingly? Unauthorized data sharing. Does the vendor share data with some of their suppliers or their suppliers' suppliers, that follow the yellow brick road down the vendor space? How much of that information are they protecting? And are they protecting it downstream? And then data ownership, go back to the example I mentioned of the exercise we ran of the energy company. Who owns that data? Does the vendor own it because it's sitting on their system? Do I own it because it's my customer data? All of those things should probably be considered as you're putting in a vendor relationship. Data backups. Again, who is responsible for making backups of my data? If I say the vendor is responsible for doing that, how do I know they're actually taking backups of things? You know, if there's a hard drive crash, if there's somebody gets in and wipes the systems clean, is there a backup of my data somewhere? As a chief information security officer, what I would say is I'm going to trust that the vendor is going to do a backup. However, I'm going to have my own backup as well. Because they're going to, I'm not going to put all my eggs in the vendor basket and say, you've got complete control of my organizational data. I'm always going to have a backup, something that I control as part of that, if I can do that, and if it's important enough that my business rests on that data and the security availability of that data. I also want to make sure that the vendor is following any type of security policies and procedures that I've stipulated for them. I want to check on that on a regular basis, and I want to make sure that how we verify compliance is documented, how we define performance standards. I want to make sure all of that is in place prior to starting a relationship with a vendor, because that's what's going to dictate terms, conditions, and the effect of when things start to go sideways on us during an incident. On-site vendor considerations. If you have on-site vendors, you've got a unique set of requirements. From escorting individuals, if you have secure areas, do you need to walk people around your facility to make sure they don't have access to sensitive information? Do you do any type of virtual monitoring? Or if you've got people sitting at computer systems, are you watching their screen? Do you see what they're seeing in terms of, I know what they're doing during the day, I know they're not copying my data off to Pastebin or something like that. You always want to make sure you've got a non-disclosure agreement in place that'll protect you to some extent if there's a breach of information or a compromise of confidential information. And then you also want to make sure that you specifically identify what those vendor personnel need in terms of access to computers, access to facilities, and you want to verify their identity as well to make sure that I've got Bob showing up from vendor X. Is that really Bob? Vendor oversight. This is a key area because it allows you to track your performance with vendors. Is my vendor adequately performing? Well, part of that is, or the first part of it is I need to set up metrics for that. I need to know when they're doing good and when they're not doing good. I need to make sure that the people who are supervising those vendors understand what is expected of those vendors so that they can make sure that the vendor's doing their job. At a company level, you might want to make sure that they're financially sound so that if I have if they're a critical supplier of widgets to me, they're not going to shut down in 3 months because they're bankrupt. That puts me in a bind now as a company because I have a dependency on them. I can't do my job if they go bankrupt. And then I also want to make sure that I have escalation process so that when the vendor does fail to meet standards, I know how to resolve that. And this is pretty common in contractual agreements now. You'll see that there are escalation and problem resolution portions of the contract itself that stipulate, okay, if we start having performance issues within 24 hours, we're going to say contact person X in our company, person Y at the vendor. And they're going to figure out what's going on. If it's still happening after 48 hours, now we escalate. And those points of contact are defined in the contract as well. There's a saying that contracts aren't necessary unless there's a problem. And really, that's what you should consider as you're writing your vendor contracts, is not necessarily the day-to-day operations, but the contract should cover you when something goes wrong. So let's look at what happened with Target and where there was a dependency on a third party here. The attackers behind the Target attack went after a third-party mechanical vendor for Target. The employee at the mechanical company was hit by a phishing email. They allowed remote access software, this Trojan, Citadel Trojan, to be installed on those computers. The vendor was actually using an anti-malware program, but it was being run on demand, not in real time. So they had some protection in place, but it wasn't continuous protection. And essentially, the attackers gained access to Target through that vendor portal, a vendor portal that Target had set up for this mechanical company. Interestingly enough, that portal was also maintained by a third party. So you see this complex web of vendors and third-party providers that's all kind of interweaved together, and understanding the risk from that is really not trivial, but that's why you have a vendor management program. But then the attackers kind of jumped through that vendor portal and into the point-of-sale system within Target, and that's where you had the PII, PCI data compromise actually occur. So some of the lessons learned from this, enhanced monitoring and logging, that kind of goes without saying. Whitelisting technology to prevent point-of-sale terminals. How is it that the vendor portal was able to access point-of-sale terminals down in the stores? Enhanced segmentation, again, does the vendor portal really need access to different aspects within Target's corporate network, within the point-of-sale network? And so by separating all of those things out, making sure that the two don't cross, you eliminate that risk. Reviewing and limiting vendor access. Does each of your vendors need access to the portal? Well, there might be a legitimate business case for that, but do they need it? That should be a conscious decision, not just, give them access, whatever.